All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us this week to give us a briefing on the top events going on in Israel this week. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you should wish to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and good evening from Israel. There's really only one place to start, and that is the admission, let's put it that way, earlier in the month by President Biden. At first it was unnamed officials or lower officials, but in the end it was President Biden himself who admitted on national TV that he has decided to put a hold on 3,500 high payload bombs, basically, as he stated, to keep Israel from doing in Rafah what it was able to do in other parts of the Gaza Strip. It was quite an unprecedented moment, as one can imagine. Not to say that military aid has ever been used as a tool before, but it certainly hasn't been used in a time of war for many years. Certainly not after what we saw in October 7th, and President Biden using the word ironclad many times in regards to Israel's security. And here he was admitting openly that he would, his administration would delay, and delay, we have to see exactly what it means delay, whether delay is permanent or just temporary. At the moment, it's certainly more than just immediate. But certainly a step like that taken, and not behind closed doors and not leaked to the press, but openly stated by the President of the United States on national TV, certainly was an unprecedented moment. In reaction, as we saw, House Republicans are trying to advance a bill to mandate delivery of offensive weapons. It probably will pass the House, probably not the Senate, but anyway, President Biden has promised that he will veto such a bill, and probably to stave off some of the criticism. It was released that the Biden administration is providing between $1 and $1.2 billion in military aid, in arms and ammunition. But what we notice, certainly not just from the type of military aid, but also from the words themselves, from the senior members of the Biden administration, including President Biden himself, of course, is that there is now a very marked difference between defensive and offensive weapons. We saw with the attack by Iran, direct attack from Iranian territory, the Biden administration was very happy, very willing, and very able to assist Israel in defending itself against those attacks, ballistic missiles, as we remember, drones, etc. But it very much put a red light against Israel responding in an offensive way. We're now seeing that play out also in the Gaza Strip with the type of munitions, ammunition, arms, bombs that Israel has or is being allowed to use, or let's put it in the most blunt terms, or is being provided by the US. As I've been saying for quite a while, almost everything, if not everything that's coming out these days from the US is very much with an eye to the elections. And there's a lot of commentary in Israel of exactly what it means, who is winning within the administration. There are those who say that there are a lot of people in the administration who are partly ignorant of what's going on in the wider ramifications of the Israel-Hamas war. It's not just between Israel and Hamas. There's issues of Iran. There's issues of the pragmatic Sunni nations. Obviously, there's in the background, there's issues related to Russia and China. And there's a feeling in Israel amongst many that many in the Biden administration don't get it. And the only people who really understand the Middle East and the strategic ramifications are those who believe that Israel should be more contained and constrained. So Israel is certainly worried about where this is going. And I've said for a number of months now that I think the situation will only get worse as we get closer to the elections. More and more measures will be taken because President Biden is fighting for his political life. We saw the polls. I'm not going to get too much into American domestic politics because certainly I'm not American and I have, that's not my area of expertise. But it's clear that President Biden is in trouble. And what I would say, just from a point of view of maybe someone who's been involved in politics, he and his advisors are trying to play both sides. On the one hand, they're trying to placate the extreme left within his party, that growing element within the Democratic Party. It's still small, but it certainly is growing, and it certainly is playing off the anti-Israel sentiment in university campuses and amongst opinion shapers and decision makers around the country. And the halting or the delay of these munitions plays into that. And on the other hand, he's able to say, well, I'm still supplying Israel with $1 billion in aid, and look at all the ammunition I'm going. So he's trying to hold his base while trying to also reach out to those who may be swaying. It's a relatively tried and trusted tactic where you can use different talking heads to placate both sides. You can say we're doing one thing to one and one thing to the other. And it seems that that's where the US appears to be, again, with around, half a year till the US elections. And there's still a very strong feeling within the administration that the Israel issue is not helping them and is significantly harming them. That seems to be the reading from Israel of what's going on within the US administration. In the region, they're seeing it very differently. Hamas is very much seeing this as an opportunity. They're seeing a lot of their goals are being met, specifically those of Yahya Sinwar. As we know, hostage negotiations pretty much have gone nowhere for a while because there just seems to be no pressure. In fact, things are going very much in Hamas's way. Israel doesn't seem to have a strategy for dismantling Hamas rule. It's really, really slowly edging into the eastern part of Rafah. It's really dipping its toes in the water there, but it hasn't undergone any full-scale operation there. Probably, almost certainly, I would argue, because the Americans are vetoing it to this point, despite protestations by Israeli President Netanyahu that Israel will go into Rafah and it will defeat Hamas. This week we saw the Nahal Brigade go into Zaytun, and they're still fighting in the north. And all of these elements are just sort of, there's a feeling that the war is going on, but without Rafah, because Rafah is such a complicated issue. We've seen Egypt has stopped its aid. From its side, it's claiming that it will not bring aid in while Israel controls the Rafah crossing, which it does now. And that's certainly putting a lot of pressure, because one could imagine the amount of aid that came in to the populations there. So that's another point of pressure. The UN just recently put out a communique that they believe around 600,000 Palestinians have already left the Rafah areas. We know there were around 1.5 million, and that was one of the main objections to the international community, because there were so many civilians in the area. Israel cannot put on an operation there that would not harm significant amounts of civilians. Israel has always said that it will take that into consideration, and it has already started asking civilians in certain areas to leave, and it seems like many of them are leaving, but we'll have to see exactly what happens there. As one can imagine, the implications on the northern border with Hezbollah, again, are problematic, because at the moment, Israel's very much in the defensive mode. On the north, it's not in an offensive mode. It hasn't really taken the battle to Hezbollah. And subsequently, what we've seen in the last few days or the last few weeks, as a result of the pressure from the US, one could argue, and certainly there are those in Israel who do so, the amount of rocket fire from Gaza has gone up massively over the last couple of weeks. And Hezbollah has even, the amount of rocket attacks daily is doubling what it was previously. So it's clear that the signs from Washington seem to be read by Israel's enemies in the region, whether in Tehran or whether it's proxies in Gaza, on the northern border, and even in Iraq. We've seen attacks from Shiite groups in Iraq on Israel in recent days, have all been seen as a sign of weakness, that there's a massive gap between Israel and the US. And if they just keep on piling on the pressure, they will significantly weaken Israel. This has all led to a certain extent to an internal political fight. We saw today something, again, pretty unprecedented. We saw Defense Minister Yoav Galant basically attack Prime Minister Netanyahu by name and saying that the lack of a long-term strategy for Gaza is harming us and is even harming our soldiers and our goals of the war. This is pretty unprecedented. We know the relationship between Galant and Netanyahu has been extremely frosty, going back even last year. I think it was in March when he was fired and then officially or unofficially reinstated. But the relationship has been extremely poor since then. But to attack the prime minister in the war by name is certainly unprecedented. The argument between Galant and, by extension, Gantz and Eisenkot is that Netanyahu is acting out of political interest just to retain his government, where decisions need to be made, and specifically about the day after for Gaza. Galant argues that because there's a lack of strategy or a lack of a plan for the day after, it's hurting our war efforts, and Israel will keep having to fight in areas that it previously fought in and previously destroyed Hamas capabilities, but it keeps on coming back to them, and we've certainly seen that in recent days. He argues that, Galant argues that we need some type of non-Hamas Palestinian presence. He says that the defense ministry and the establishment which he leads will not countenance any sort of military or civilian, Israeli military or Israeli civilian governance, administration after the war, and calls on Netanyahu to bring in or to create or to formulate some alternative. Galant, basically reading between the lines, is saying that that just because Smotrich and Ben Gvir will certainly contest and maybe even leave the government as a result, felling this government, or at least the narrow government before Gantz joined, is the reason preventing him from coming up with this plan. Netanyahu responded and said, I will have no Hamastan and I will also have no Fatahstan. And we know Fatah is the party of the Palestinian Authority, the party of Mahmoud Abbas. And the argument in Israel is that Fatah is not much better than Hamas. They support Hamas. They're paying the terrorists and their families of the October 7th massacres and the incitement that's coming out. And certainly it's not one that Netanyahu will countenance, and that's one supported largely by the government. The problem is the alternatives are very problematic at this moment. Israel has tried a few alternatives. First of all, the idea of bringing in the PA itself has said, we will not come in on Israeli tanks. In other words, we will not come in and rule the Gaza Strip unless we're invited by the Palestinian people and not by the Israeli government. So that is out for the moment. The idea of ruling by certain clans, Israel did reach out to certain clans within Gaza. As we know, Palestinian society is very much clan-based, and certain areas of the Strip are governed by clans. But we saw those clans threatened. The one clan which did say that they would work with Israel to help in the civilian rule afterwards was attacked by Hamas. Some of its leaders were assassinated, others were arrested. So that idea also got thrown out. The latest idea that has been talked a little bit more openly than perhaps arguably should have is to bring in a conglomeration of Arab states, and specifically the UAE was mentioned. And again, the UAE would be, let's just say, not necessarily happy, but would play some role with some other Arab states after the war's finished, after and only after Hamas has been defeated. It's certainly these discussions will have happened, and I'm sure there'll be some sympathy among some pragmatic governments, but they will not want to be mentioned publicly at this point, which is what Netanyahu did. And also, they will not come in, they will not push their troops in, they will not put their resources in while Hamas is still there. Behind closed doors, the message from these governments is, you've got to first defeat Hamas before we can even talk about any sort of efforts from our point of view. So it's really a difficult idea that Netanyahu can come out with a strategy, because whatever strategy he comes out with could be easily shot down by those involved with it, as we've seen before, or give Hamas a target. And Netanyahu is very much holding to the line that first we have to defeat Hamas, and then we can talk about the day after. Finally, and also importantly, especially for the future of this government, the Haredi ultra-Orthodox enlistment issue has come up again. And what Netanyahu has rather cleverly tried to do is he's tried to now take the enlistment law that was created or formulated under the government before this, which was the Bennett-Lapid government, where Benny Gantz, who's now in this current government, who was defense minister at the time, came up with what he describes as a framework for ultra-Orthodox enlistment. In fact, the numbers were very low, and the main goal of that was to try and allow ultra-Orthodox to go out to the workforce, because at the moment, if they do not go to the army, it means they're learning yeshiva, which means they're not allowed to legally work. So there was a way to try and move around that. Obviously, a lot has changed since then. Gantz and Galant and others have argued that even at the time, those numbers were insufficient. But more importantly, it was a different bill for a different time. Post-October 7th, Israel needs a lot more soldiers. According to estimates I heard earlier, the amount of killed and the amount of injured of Israeli soldiers is now in 3,000-4,000, and that's quite significant numbers. And Israel needs soldiers now, not by 2030 or 2035. And even the numbers of Haredi enlistment are really paltry in comparison. But what Netanyahu is trying to do is trying to embarrass those now in the opposition who are then in the government, who voted and passed it through its first reading of this Haredi enlistment law. So it could be brought up in the Knesset for the second and third readings in the coming days, the coming weeks, in the all-important summer Knesset session, where, again, which we spoke about a few weeks ago, if Benny Gantz's ultimatum is to be believed, he will then call for elections. And Netanyahu is trying very hard to get through the summer session, because once he's through the summer session, then we get into the Jewish holidays, and then we're quite a number of months down the track. So we'll have to keep an eye on all these elements on the diplomatic and internal political front in the days and weeks ahead. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thank you for the briefing, Ashley. We have plenty of questions that are coming in. It seems like the burning question on everyone's mind, David Levine asks this, and I think it sums it up. He asks, the UN has finally admitted that the casualty figures provided by Hamas are grossly inflated. This would appear to be a perfect opportunity for Israel to use some more positive public relations. Is any effort being made in that direction?
Well, first of all, the UN tried very hard to keep those numbers under wraps, and just they didn't put out a press release. They didn't put out any sort of communique admitting to the fact that Hamas had inflated the numbers by 10,000, especially amongst women and children. And the UN had basically it was OCHA, which basically inflated the numbers. And the only response came from during a press conference from a reporter from JNS, a Jewish pro-Israel publication. So they were trying very hard to keep it under wraps. Their explanation was that these things happen in the fog of war, and that's what it should be put down to. Then obviously the question of the right reliability was brought up, and they basically tried to sidestep it. Israel, through Prime Minister Netanyahu, did try and take advantage and try to use those reformulated numbers to show that, in fact, what Israel had been saying all along was true, that in this war, more or less, there's been a 1-to-1 ratio, a one civilian non-combatant to one combatant ratio, which is pretty unprecedented in history, in modern history, certainly in urban asymmetrical warfare. Unfortunately, a message is only as strong as those who will pick it up. from what I've seen of much of the international media and much of foreign international figures, they're still using the larger numbers, the 30,000 to 35,000 plus, even though OSHA came out, the UN body came out and said it's closer to 25,000. But, so these things take a lot of time to change. And as we know, the UN certainly is not going to scream it from the rooftops that they got the numbers wrong and that everybody should now use those revised numbers. So it's very difficult to do. Israel is trying to do it. Its spokespeople have been, trying to put out as much messaging, doing interviews as much as possible to bring attention to this new number. But as I said, it's a struggle because it needs the media and foreign officials to play along, which largely, they're not. We know that even the number 35,000 was parroted by the Biden administration up until recently. We haven't heard any numbers since then, so we don't know whether they're still using those numbers. But it just goes to show how far basic numbers that the Hamas run health ministry are being parroted, and even when they're being corrected, it's still a major struggle. Israel is certainly trying to push that narrative, is trying to show that 1-to-1 ratio is unprecedented. It's 9 times better than the international average. It's 4 to 5 times better than the US, Britain, and other allies used in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere. And so it's trying its best to try and highlight these numbers, but again, it's one thing to get the message out. It's another thing for it to be heard by the millions of people around the world.
Now, even before the United Nations put out their revised casualty count, as I recall, even Hamas, aka the Gaza Ministry of Health, put out a similar statement that admitted that their own numbers were inflated. Now, why do you think it is that across college campuses and activist groups and even NGOs, why do you think it is that people still insist on using the inflated number? It's almost like they want there to be more dead Palestinians.
Well, that's, first of all, your last statement was true. But Hamas never said that the numbers were inflated. What they started doing is, for most of the war, they've just been giving their total number of dead. Only a number, I think a couple of weeks ago, they started saying, well, we've only officially identified 25 of the 35,000. And so it never said that there's not 35,000 dead. They said we've only been able to completely identify 25,000. But the numbers are less important at this point because in the war of narratives, there are innocents dying. And when there are innocents dying, I spoke to someone the other day from the US who claims to be a hardcore Zionist and still thinks that Israel's engaged in genocide. And when I pressed them on that, I said, well, how do you define genocide? And that they basically define it, well, civilians are dying. I said, well, then every war in history was genocide. What British did against the Nazis in the Second World War was genocide. What the US did in Japan was genocide. What every single war in history, because unfortunately, the narrative and the branding on the other side is very strong. It's very disciplined. And to use the word, they've tried a lot of things. They've tried Israel's Nazis, Israel's apartheid. They had varying levels of success. The narrative of Israel's genocide has been far more successful. First of all, because the ICJ, even though the ruling of the ICJ thus far has been completely appropriated. In fact, it took the head of the ICJ to go on a British news show and say that what was attributed to us in our intermediate ruling is completely false. We do not say that there's a good likelihood of Israel engaging in genocide. We just said that Israel shouldn't engage in genocide. And there's a marked difference. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter. The messaging is already out there from Israel's enemies, from South Africa, from all those who are involved in the case. And the genocide moniker has stuck. And it's very, very difficult because there are dead people dying on the other side. There are images which are being used, utilized, appropriated, etc. But because there's no context, because if this is the only war and even though there are thousands and tens of thousands of people dying in other conflicts in the world that most Americans, let's put it this way, or Europeans or whoever, have never even heard of, is irrelevant. What they see now is as if it's the only war in the world and the worst war, at least in recent memory. So it is getting through this genocide accusation, and it's a very, very tough one to fight. But Israel is trying to fight it. Israel is trying to show that the numbers are in context pretty good, in fact, unprecedented and historic, but people are dying. So it's very hard to sort of pat yourself on the back while people are dying on the other side. So it's a real struggle, but Israel is trying to put as much context as possible to these numbers.
Yeah, and I do wish people would understand that if Israel was indeed committing a genocide, they are quite incompetent at it. Now, we have a question from Len Getz, who asks, we're hearing today of many Israeli casualties in Gaza. Can you give us more information about that?
Well, yes, there are some that have yet to be released. I just heard rumors. There's always rumors because, as you can imagine, there's all sorts of people in the military establishment at all different levels, whether they're people on the ground or higher levels, who hear things before they come out. But yeah, Israel is, as I said earlier in my remarks, Israel is now fighting battles which in areas that it formerly conquered. Again, your last remark, if Israel is committing genocide, they wouldn't need to send in a single soldier. They just could carpet bomb from the side. I mean, my brother-in-law, my nephew, friends, children of friends, neighbors are all in Gaza at this very point, or have been in the last couple of days, specifically because Israel does not want to do that, does not want to kill civilians. So it's going in, person by person, fighting, building by building, sometimes room by room, specifically to try and minimize the amount of casualties, civilian casualties. So yeah, that's the sort of bottom line with what Israel is doing, and the casualties are totting up, perhaps because as some accuse Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's no overall strategy. We keep on giving a green light to go into Rafah, and then it gets pulled back. So some are arguing that we're fighting in other areas just to make sure that there's still some momentum to be able to show the Israeli public, because it's stalled very much in the eastern neighborhoods of Rafah. So we'll have to wait and see. But certainly the Israeli army is still motivated, but it doesn't seem to have made that decision to go into Rafah full tilt as it did to Gaza City and other parts of the north. So we'll have to wait and see, because Netanyahu keeps on saying, we will go to Rafah, we will defeat Hamas. He's still talking about total victory, even though the Americans are now starting to say there is no such thing as total victory, and we do not believe Israel can be victorious, which is also giving a little bit of a wind to Hamas at this point.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have a question from Francisco Fonseca. Apologies if I mispronounce that, but the question is, who are the alternative groups to replace Hamas, since the United Arab Emirates nixed the idea altogether?
Well, first of all, as I said, they didn't nix the idea completely. What they said is they will not go in now, and one can understand why. When Hamas are still there, they don't want to be seen as Israel's patsy. They don't want to put their actual people on the ground, whether it's army or other civilian governance people, which will be openly attacked. I mean, we've seen that Hamas have attacked attacked aid workers with the pier that the US is building off the coast of Gaza. It even is attacking the points of aid distribution. So I'm sure they would find no qualms about attacking UAE or other Arab officials. So they haven't nixed it forever. They've nixed it to a point where Hamas is no more. At the moment, as I said, the three real main groups that Israel can work with, to one level or another, has been tried or has been written off, whether it's the PA or some sort of bureaucratic government, but it would have to be under the PA, which is something that Netanyahu can't approve of, because Smotrich and Ben Gvir would immediately leave, and the PA itself does not want to, as it said, come in on Israeli tanks. The others are, as I said, the pragmatic Arab governments, which, yes, can play some role after the war's been finished and Hamas have been destroyed, but will certainly not come in beforehand. And that really leaves the final option, which is local Palestinians in Gaza. And at the moment, very few are going to come forward and take any sort of role, considering they will then have a target and their families will have a target on their back from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist organizations. So at the moment, it's very, very hard to look at alternatives to Hamas in Gaza when Hamas is still a fighting force and still has a major threat, and there is still major dread amongst the Gazan population about standing up to Hamas. Yes, we've seen pockets here or there, but it's one thing to be shouting slogans on a street corner. It's another thing to take an official role, which will basically be under Israeli control and sort of stand in ostensibly for Hamas. And that is, one can imagine, a far more dangerous proposition, and one that there'll be few takers for at this point.
Okay, well, thank you. We have unfortunately run out of time and reached the end of this week's podcast. Thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time to give us an update.
Thank you.
And for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout over the weekend for our weekly podcast offerings. Should be landing in your inbox sometime Saturday or Sunday. We thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.